Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this media launch of the second report of the Independent International Commission of Investigation into Human Rights Violations in the Philippines. My name is Peter Murphy. I'm speaking to you from Gadigal land in Sydney, Australia, as the chairperson of the core working group of Investigateph. I want to acknowledge the two French interpreters who are working with us tonight, Claude Afezuke and Nadia Mehindu. They're from Gabon in Africa, and it's very much appreciated your work tonight. This launch event takes place during the 47th regular session of the United Nations Human Rights Council, one of the primary audiences for our report. Since we launched our initial report on March 16 during the 46th session, the human rights situation in the Philippines has continued to deteriorate, as you will hear from our speakers today. Also, the outgoing prosecutor of the International Criminal Court just 3 weeks ago recommended that the ICC launch an active investigation of the crime against humanity of murder committed by police in the Philippines in the so-called war on drugs, and other crimes going back to November 2011, when the ICC first had jurisdiction in the Philippines. We at Investigateph share with many victims' families in the Philippines a feeling of hope and affirmation in this decision by the outgoing prosecutor. We call on the Philippine government to cooperate with the investigation and for state parties to the Rome Statute to hold the Philippine government accountable for any non-cooperation. Now, to launch this second report, we have 4 speakers who will each speak for 5 minutes. 3 of them are high-level commissioners of Investigateph, and 1 is a resource person in the Philippines who contributed to the investigation. Following their short presentations, we will have a Q&A session for the media present here today. And I'm asking the journalists to please put your questions into the Zoom function Q&A as we go along. And it would help, as the opening slide showed, if media workers would put the word media in their Zoom name to help with the smooth flow of the questions. So let me introduce the first speaker. It is Lee Rhiannon, a former Australian senator, who will highlight the section on the war on poor people in the guise of a war on drugs. Please welcome Lee Rhiannon.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. The evidence we have collected in this inquiry has brought us to the overwhelming conclusion that President Duterte's war on drugs is in fact a war on poor people. Behind the shocking figures I will shortly share with you are so many tragic stories of young men killed in front of their families, children left destitute after the main breadwinner is murdered, the stigma of false allegations leaving children terrorised by neighbours and school friends. President Duterte launched his war on drugs on the 30th of June 2016, the day he took office. Between 1 July 2016 and 31 December 2020, the official government figures lists 6,011 deaths in anti-drug operations. It is becoming increasingly understood that these figures are not accurate. The United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights found that the figure up to March 2020 was at least 8,663. Other studies cite the number of killings as almost 3 times higher than that figure. If the president was serious about countering illegal drug use, his government would deal with this matter as a health issue. But the war on drugs has not been about assisting drug users to end their addiction. This war has turned the Philippines into a brutal police state. Much of the evidence that we have been presented with reveals that the police have executed victims in their home, on the street, or after being abducted. We saw photographic evidence that police attempted to cover up their execution of unarmed victims. Dead bodies had their arms bound by handcuffs or zip ties, suggesting that they were killed while detained and unable to resist. A witness saw the police execute 3 men and then plant guns on them. In some cases, independent autopsies of victims' bodies could be carried out. The evidence showed that proper procedures were not followed in the police autopsy. Death certificates were inaccurate. The examination did not include x-rays nor a record of defensive wounds. Clinical evidence from the professor of forensic pathology at the University of the Philippines, Dr. Raquel Fortun, revealed instances where a proper autopsy was not conducted. The impact of these killings do not end when the victim dies. When a person is killed in police operations, their loved ones are often left stigmatized, leading to social isolation. Financial hardship adds to their suffering. The ongoing misery is sickening. Funeral parlours often work closely with local police. Some extort huge fees from families before the families can retrieve the body of their loved one. Pressure from the police on families to not lodge a complaint is often intense at this time and for years after. Of all the thousands killed during the drug wars, since the drug wars were instigated in 2016, police have only been convicted of 1 murder. Kian de los Santos was abducted by police in August 2017. The killing of this young man is known because the local government officers forgot to turn off the CCTV. Despite this solid evidence, no police commanders were charged. Only 3 low-level police officers were. The Filipino judicial and legislative systems are increasingly complicit in these crimes and in repressing government critics. The police system of killing in the war on drugs is called tokang, meaning to knock on the door and persuade. It is really kick in the door and shoot. Since 2020, this system has been applied to the war on dissent as well, which has been considerably expanded by President Duterte's Executive Order 70. This institutionalized a whole-of-nation approach to defeat progressive forces in the Philippines. This expanded the government departments required to cooperate with the military and the police to include local government, education, health, welfare, and in fact, all government agencies. Executions of targets during house raids is now commonplace. The war on poor people in the guise of a war on drugs is a giant killing machine that must be stopped. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee. I want to move to our next speaker, but first of all, remind people, the participants, that if you have a question, use the Q&A function. I understand somebody put their hand up, but now's not the time. We'll have all of that discussion with the commissioners in the Q&A session. So I'd now like to introduce Reverend Dr. Chris Ferguson, a minister of the United Church of Canada and the General Secretary of the World Communion of Reformed Churches based in Hanover in Germany. He's going to highlight the section of the report on the war on dissent. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, and thanks to my colleague Lee, who already set the stage. In the first report, what was displayed through lifting up the testimonies of 50 emblematic cases was the gross systemic abuse of political and civil rights. And here we now see a pattern to understand what lies under the so-called war on drugs and its hideous assault on the lives and dignity of the Filipino people. And as was indicated by the earlier speaker, this report clearly, listening to expert witnesses and those directly affected, has shown how the methodology of the war on drugs, particularly this local-based raising up of politically motivated search warrants that allow people to, the police and the military, to break into homes and to claim that there is false resistance to arrest, even though these warrants are not arrest warrants at all, leading to effectively the extrajudicial assassination of people who are considered left-leaning or in any way dissenting. We see now not only a pattern that was revealed in the first report of the failure of the system to be able to investigate or correct itself, the failure of the system to provide recourse for those who are wronged, but in fact we see revealed through laws, as been alluded to, the anti-terrorism law and mechanisms like the National Task Force to end local communist armed combat, actually proactive mechanisms of the state rather that promote and propagate state terror in response to the attempt of people to organize and lift up their own cause of justice and to defend their rights. In this situation, we see the war on drugs mechanisms, as I say, applied. And moreover, we see the weaponization of legal mechanisms, and we can clearly have heard witnesses to understand that through mechanisms such as red tagging, and I would just like to explain this kind of specific mechanism that has been used of the act of labeling, branding, naming, and accusing individuals and or organizations of being left-leaning, subversive, communists, or terrorists. And it is a strategy by state agents, particularly law enforcement agencies and the military, against those perceived to be threats or enemies of the state. And to be clear, this is virtually a death sentence leading to people's arrest and or killing. To the impunity under which this is carried out is a cover that, once identified as a communist or a terrorist, all attempts to suppress the so-called communist threat become legitimate. And the report clearly lifts up the illegitimacy of any attempt to abrogate or deny or suspend human rights, regardless of the context, regardless of any state of armed conflict. And certainly there is clear guidelines in the international community that insist on the respect of human rights, not only international humanitarian law, but in the conduct of countering terrorism. Cases that come particularly to mind show how broad and deep this problem is in the war on dissent, ranging from trade unionists to religious leaders, NGOs, lawyers defending the poor and powerless, particularly political opposition leaders, all easily branded by state agencies, police, and by the president himself as communists or related to as legal front organizations. And this, as I have to underline again, is not only a situation of violation of international law, but deeply moves to institute a political agenda, and it goes in line with the deeper purposes of the so-called war against drugs. I want to simply point out that this report, in focusing on these mechanisms and the question of the war on dissent, and I'm particularly concerned, for instance, that other rights are involved here, so that where we see that that people that defend rights are attacked, it is particularly when they're defending the rights of people protecting their land or the rights of indigenous people and so on. So there is a wide variety of rights that are at stake. and in my case, I want to lift up, that including and especially the right to practice one's own religion, that many of the church groups and leaders who have been attacked and vilified or killed or arrested have in fact been exercising their own religious duties to care for the poor and to seek justice. We are bringing with this report a series of recommendations, first of all, to the International Human Rights Council, and we are to be summarized. You can see the recommendations in the report, but they focus on holding the government accountable and responsible for the killings, abductions, and disappearances, illegal arrests and detentions, harassments, and other forms of violations of human rights, to ensure that this accountability happens at all levels of government officials, ensure, in fact, that the president himself is held critically liable for the official orders given by the president. And we also call for the UN mechanisms to provide protection for all the witnesses in this and other human rights investigations. And it is important that we provide protection to all those, whether members, teachers, members of the academy, whether it is trade unionists, lawyers, journalists, all be protected as they exercise their freedom and rights to protect the rights of others. Many fact-finding missions will be required to really hold this government to account and to see that they are not only failing to protect their people, but are actively violation of the rights of their own people. I want to lift up again, as I said, a particular reference to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The International Criminal Court, as Peter has mentioned, is beginning its investigation. We hope that this calls on them to pursue the investigation and to accelerate the depth and breadth of holding this government accountable. Similarly to the International Labor Organization, we're calling to expedite the high-level tripartite mission to the Philippines, which was already decided in 2019. All civil society folks in the international community are called to embrace this report, to circulate its findings, to debate its conclusions and put them into action, and to mobilize for the call for accountability and justice for all victims. And I think that one important thing to say as we head into an electoral context is to be very clear that this upcoming election in the year 2022 will require intense international monitoring, and we call on civil society to mobilize to ensure there are adequate international observers for that process. Thank you, Peter, and thanks to all who we hope will take the urgency and the seriousness of this report to heart.
Thank you very much, Chris. Can I now introduce Attorney Suzanne Adderley? She is the president of the National Lawyers Guild of the USA. Attorney Suzanne is presenting the section of the report on the war on the Moro people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Peter. As Peter stated, I want to sort of take this opportunity to call attention to what we have read in the report in regards to human rights violations that have taken place in Mindanao, particularly since 2017 when the city of Marawi was put under siege. With financial and tactical support from the United States, as well as other states, the Philippines government launched an unjust war in Mindanao, which they have justified in the labeling of that operation as a war on terrorism. The Philippines military operations have not distinguished between civilians and combatants and has led to the killing of over 1,000 civilians in during their operations and the displacement of hundreds of thousands. The Moro peoples, as I have been learning, have long been fighting for their self-determination and have historically had to struggle for their human rights from colonial powers, namely Spain and America, from Philippines governments and leadership, and from multinational corporations, all who have or have had economic and political interests on the island. I think that it's very important to consider the ways that Philippines military attacks, sieges, encampments, and ongoing operations in Mindanao serve as a pretext to militarize the area in order to protect government and corporate interests. I think that there are things that are highlighted in this report and in the statements by witnesses that lend weight to this consideration, including the attacks and massacres against farmers in the region that we have seen, the Sulu massacre, the Cabacan massacre. I think what also lends weight to that consideration is we look at the other ways in which other states, namely the United States, although not only the United States, and the way that they have used their war on terror campaigns as a tool for power grabs in ways that in fact help to create more violence. However, even if the Philippines government was sincere in their intentions of counterterrorism, quote, counterterrorism, the Philippines, like any other UN member state, are obligated to ensure that all measures taken to counterterrorism comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and international refugee law. But again, what we've seen is consistent inability of Philippines military operations in Mindanao to distinguish between civilians and combatants. In August 2020, we saw an incident which was characterized as a counterterrorism raid, which led to the deaths of 26 civilians. And this is even after the martial law was officially lifted. Furthermore, as the report points out, the Philippines military have used mortar fire, artillery fire, and aerial bombing in their operations. And these methods are in their nature forms of warfare that when used in densely populated areas have often led to mass killing of civilians. And these are the primary weapons that have been used in Marawi City since 2017 and continue to be weapons of choice in other states. Again, we know that this has led to the killing of civilians as well as the displacement of hundreds of thousands, many of who have still not been able to return to their ancestral homes despite their right to return under international law. It has also led to increased poverty in the region. What we've learned is that the region is among the poorest in the Philippines, even before the siege took place. Increased fear as the region is more militarized. And even though martial law has been officially lifted, in effect, it still exists under this framework of state of emergency. And such actions, all of these actions, are in breach of international humanitarian law. It's important, I think, when looking at both the situation in Mindanao and in the situation that has been summarized by our colleagues in regards to the sort of the war on terror and the war on dissent, that we put continuous sort of like pressure on the international community, including the United Nations, institutions, and civil society, to call for accountability. And in this regard, accountability for the killing of Moro civilians, an end to the operations leading to these civilians, and an end to what is effectively still martial law, and the right of return for internally displaced. I just want to now kind of like move attention to the ways in which other states have become complicit in Philippines' violations of international law, international humanitarian law, international human rights law. The US and other foreign governments have been supplying weapons, intelligence, and training, as well as military aid to the Philippines. And in countries such as the US, who provide military aid to the Duterte regime, are complicit in the worsening human rights situation in the Philippines. And the US itself has committed over $300 million in military aid to support these operations since 2015. And it has sent over hundreds of millions in planes and ships and other military equipment to the Philippines government, mostly for their use in Mindanao. And it's time for the United States to also stop enabling and abetting human rights violations against the people of the Philippines. And so in addition to contributing to this call for the international community to act for accountability of the Philippines government in their human violations against the Philippines people, I also would like to uplift a call for the citizens of the United States to put pressure on their US government and particularly the US Congress, to introduce and support the Philippines Human Rights Act, which is an act that states that US military aid to the Philippines is in violation of US laws, and namely what we refer to as the Leahy Law, which says that foreign aid cannot be used, should not be used to support gross violations of human rights. And I think it's very important, and particularly when looking at the situation in Mindanao, but elsewhere in the Philippines, to not only call for accountability for the actions of the Philippines government, for accountability from the United States and other states who, in their support of through military aid and through the sharing of intelligence and training and weapons, are abetting and complicit in these human rights violations. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you very, very much, Suzanne. I want to now introduce Ruby Lynn Litau. She is a deaconess with the United Methodist Church and coordinator of Rise Up for Life and for Rights, a community-based organization set up in 2016 to defend communities against the war on drugs. She is a voice from the Filipino community, which Investigateph was set up to respond to. Go ahead, please, Ruby Lynn.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for everyone for this opportunity. I'm speaking in behalf of the families who are working with. Families affected by Duterte's war on drugs continue their search for justice. Such justice remains elusive when the Duterte administration is both unable and unwilling to genuinely investigate and prosecute drug war killings. As was mentioned before, there are more than 6,000 killings under police operations as per government reports, and thousands more crimes under investigation. Thus, a pattern of widespread and systematic murder and pro forma non-laban reports are ruining the fabric of Philippine society. Any illusion of our country being one that upholds basic rights and democracy has been stained under Duterte's tokhang and under state policies, like the anti-terror law. In the pursuit of justice and accountability, we look to the International Criminal Court as an important mechanism to seek redress when none could be found from our own government. Our hearts are heavy at this situation in our country, as was shared by Lee. Thank you, Lee, for giving the description before we begin this call. We are grateful for the attention afforded thus far through the ICC. As mentioned by the outgoing prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, the prosecutor considers that there is a reasonable basis to proceed with an investigation in relation to alleged crimes against humanity of murder and other crimes which are sufficiently linked to the war on drugs campaign. Thus, here in the Philippines and in Rise Up, we continue to appeal to the international community to extend solidarity and engage actions that can address the human rights crisis in the Philippines. Specifically, we will continue to strengthen the call to stop the killings in the Philippines and journey with the victims' families in their quest for justice. We'll continue to amplify support for the victims' families of drug-related killings and violations in their quest for justice and accountability. And we enjoin the United Nations Human Rights Council to conduct an independent investigation on the rights situation in the Philippines and the International Criminal Court pre-trial chamber to grant the prosecutor's request for an investigation in the drug war killings and violations. Duterte has caused us so much hardship in these last 5 years. And in his last remaining days, war against the poor continues. Together with the mothers we are working with, Nanay Emily, Nanay Lore, Nanay Jane, Nanay Emily, Nanay Normita, Nanay Irma, and many, many mothers who are giving their stories, we won't stop our call for justice and accountability. We will hold President Duterte and other perpetrators accountable for drug killings in the Philippines. Prosecute those most responsible for crime against humanity under the Duterte administration. We will continue to shout, stop the killings, fight for justice. Itigil ang pamamaslang, katarungan, ipaglaban. Salamat.
Thank you very, very much, Ruby Lynn Natal. So the participants now have heard 4 different takes on the content of the second report. And now we should move into the Q&A session with the media. Again, I ask any media workers to put their questions into the Q&A function of the Zoom. And I will start now with one from Stuart Howard, who's asked, instead of conducting an investigation, the United Nations Human Rights Council decided to provide technical cooperation to the Philippines. Have you been able to make any assessment of the effect of this cooperation? So would any of the panelists like to answer that?
Should I?
Please
Peter?
go ahead, Chris. Yeah, go ahead.
I think the first thing we ought to say is that the recommendations of the Human Rights Council were extremely disappointing because they fundamentally dodged the need for an investigation. And what we have lifted up in our reports is not so much a specific assessment of the measures taken and their effect. And although we do have been informed of some of the issues, I think that the findings of the report rather point to the fundamental reality that the measures taken don't speak to the fact that we have overwhelming evidence that the government of the Philippines has no interest and no political will to hold themselves or others to account for the violation of human rights, and that what is mostly at stake is not a question of beefing up existing mechanisms, but really creating a thoroughgoing investigation that will hold the the government to account for the violation. So in other words, the fact that things have gotten worse since the establishment of this offer of technical assistance, and the fact that there seems to be a systematic use of government's resources to continue and to expand the violation of human rights without any sense of remorse or self-examination, but rather political justification, seems to indicate, I think, that the de facto assessment is that the resources offered didn't make the case of the severe and gross violations of human rights and the real state of state-sponsored terrorism that exists in the Philippines. Falls short of the mark.
Thank you very much, Chris. We have a question from Jobel Adan from Pinoy Weekly. President Duterte has recently called the prosecutor's decision, that is the ICC prosecutor's decision, a political move, given the national elections next year. Have you any response to this? Would anyone like to take that one up? What about Lee?
Yes, I'm happy to come in on this. Look, I often find when people use that term, it's a political move. It means that they actually don't have an adequate explanation for what is going on. I'll just go back up to the question's gone. Can you just repeat the question again, Peter, please? Sorry, it's gone.
The question was that the president has said the ICC decision to investigate is a political move aimed at the next election. So, you know, what's the response?
Yeah. So it's the president actually refusing to engage with the bulk of the overwhelming evidence that is just mounting within the Philippines through the work of Investigateph, through the ICC, on all those platforms. It is obviously would be putting pressure on him, and he just tries to dismiss it by saying it's political, and the hope that people will think that discredits it. It doesn't. It yes, it is political, but he still has to answer the fact, and it's just a way of avoiding the issue.
Okay. Can I share something?
Please go ahead, Rubilin.
Okay. There was a forum before that says this move by the ICC is a political issue because of election. And one of our lawyers told us that what is at stake because ICC is not involved in the Philippine election. So that comments from Malacanang or from Duterte himself is very questionable because ICC is not involved in the coming elections. So that's our take on that question.
Peter, can't hear you.
Thank you very much, Rubilin.
Okay.
Okay, the next question comes from Carlo Brolagda, who says he's a lawyer working for Ideals, a local NGO providing free legal services to victims of human rights violations. I just want to ask, aside from the International Criminal Court, what other international mechanisms can we use or tap, both in the short and long term, to seek justice and accountability? So can I put this one perhaps to Attorney Suzanne? She's not there.
Yes, Suzanne, I think had indicated maybe she was having network problems.
There she is.
Yeah, I guess.
Oh, great.
I'm just going back. Can you repeat the question for me then?
It's a question from a human rights lawyer in the Philippines saying, aside from the ICC, what other international mechanisms can we use or tap in both in the short and long term to seek justice and accountability?
Well, I think, the ICC is an important one, right? And as well as parallel institutions like the UN Human Rights Council, who we are continuing to also kind of like urge in kind of strengthening or sort of expanding their reporting and calls for justice in the Philippines. I think that, it's important that we are engaged in putting pressure on, as many international institutions as possible to take this up, right? But I think that parallel to that has to be continuing to also call upon the civil society institutions, throughout the globe, and particularly in places where the Duterte regime continues to get support, like in the United States, right? I think whether it's the ICC or other UN mechanisms, the way that we are able to, succeed in using those mechanisms for justice in the short term and in the long term is, for that to be sort of coupled with sort of a strong change in sort of public engagement, in global public engagement. There has to be a strong call from the broader global community to say that these human rights violations in the Philippines cannot continue, and that we support the ICC and other UN mechanisms in their pursuit of justice. And we also support efforts within our own states, whether that be the US or in Europe or in Israel, to say that we're no longer going to support our own government's kind of complicity in this by providing aid to the Duterte regime, even as they are sort of clearly engaged in gross human rights violations. That would be my response.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Lee, did you want to add to that?
Suzanne actually covered it. Just to add very briefly, the bilateral aspects of it is considerable. I'm in Australia. The Australian government's had a long history of providing military aid. A number of countries do provide assistance to the military, assistance to the police, and that's something that really should be ending now. So it's a very good way that we can campaign within our own countries. It's a mechanism that I think in part answers the question.
Okay, go ahead, Chris.
No, I would just say I tried to allude to two things I think that are important as well. Not only the who in terms of what instances, but the what. I think that much emphasis has to be placed because so much of this has to do with land and displacement, extractive industries, displacement of the poor for the interests of the few. I think that much more emphasis in mobilizing around the rights of Indigenous people and rural peoples using instruments like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, really calling for a scrutiny of deals with mining companies and other extractive industries. So it isn't only the pure human rights agenda narrowly understood, but mobilizing around the rights of the people using the instruments that are provided for. So not only going to the human rights mechanisms on questions of political and civil rights, but more broadly. And I would say, for instance, that in terms of the church and religious communities, for instance, it is clearly an assault against religious freedom and belief that people who stand up for the poor are persecuted for doing so. And I think that there's just calling for the imagination that Carlos asked, put forward, I think, using that. But I think that also what has been mentioned by both Suzanne and Lee is extremely important, is that all of us where we stand have, I think, an imperative to understand the governments that are listed, and we've mentioned some of them, but I have to include Japan and Canada, South Korea, are complicit. And I think that we need to understand it isn't just using pressure to get the Filipino government to stop from doing something, but that in fact the whole international community right now is standing by while mechanisms of corporate profit and foreign policy of other countries are destroying the lives of people in the Philippines. So I think the mobilization has to be to the global instances, but also very strongly, as Lee indicated, to take on our bilateral responsibilities.
Okay, thank you, Chris. So we're running a bit on the edge of our time now, but there's one question in a different angle. How should it's from Jean Vanessa Lim. How should the Philippines better act on its obligations to protect the rights of Filipinos? And in this case, she's asking about preventing the victimization of citizens by the likes of the New People's Army. So this is a question about other groups in conflict situation in the Philippines also committing alleged human rights abuses. So would somebody like to take that one up?
I think that the first thing that has been displayed in this is that in the Philippines, in the situation of the context, what we have understood is that all the mechanisms of human rights and civilian protection for everybody everywhere in the Philippines have been eroded. And the best answer to how to protect is to reinforce the rule of law, to make sure there is not impunity on any side by anyone, and that all the mechanisms, so it isn't a special answer for this group or that group, but the special attention of our report is the people that are called to take responsibility for making sure that those mechanisms are there and that they work is the government itself, who is not only not doing so, but the chief perpetrators of abuses. So that if you say, what about the context that is raised? Who's protecting us from other groups that harass or bother us? The answer has to be a unified answer that's the same, that if we are interested in defending and protecting the rights of the people of the Philippines, we will build strong mechanisms and the international community will make sure they work.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'll go for one more question. This is going back to the elections. This is from Anlu Mutia. How would the re-election of Duterte intending to run as vice president have its implication on any prosecution of him? If his daughter wins as the president and he is the vice president, would this let him get away with the ICC, given that the ICC has no police to arrest him? It's a complicated question, but it's a tactic in the elections. So perhaps, I don't know if Ruby Lynn would like to have a go at that one.
Kindly repeat the question, please.
Sorry, Ruby Lynn. It's a question.
Okay.
It's a question about the implication of, say, Sarah Duterte becoming the president and Rodrigo Duterte being the vice president. Would this let him get away from the ICC investigation?
In one of our sharing with the ecumenical group, they are saying that the ICC investigation will actually in a survey when this was announced by Batu Bensouda, I think there was a decline in some decline of support to the present government, because especially in our conversation with the families, they are saying now ICC has put some problems to Rodrigo, to the president, because he has to face it, and still he is trying to evade, but the ICC has its own mechanism to investigate, and so we believe that the ICC has implication to the coming election. So that's why we continue to encourage the families, we continue to encourage the victims to speak out, because we believe that this will help in our quest for justice and to stop the killings, actually. And because if another Duterte will be in place, then the killings will continue and there will be no accountability. So that's why we are having this campaign to stop the killings, and then join with other groups to really show to the world that the present government has no legacy to speak of because of its impunity being perpetrated in our country. So please join us, and please pray for us, and join us in our forthcoming solidarity activities in regards to how can we put an end to this impunity, to stop the killings, because the killings continue actually. So I think that's the ICC has implication to this to the coming election. So yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Ruby Lynn. We've got one last one from Budi. He's from Franciscans International in Geneva. He says, in the Human Rights Council in September, the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights will present her oral update on the implementation of the Human Rights Council's 2020 resolution. This is the one about technical and capacity building assistance to the Philippines government on human rights. So what is your expectation from this report? Could I pass this one back to you, Lee?
When just to clarify, the last bit is what, it's just jumped again. What is your expectation from this report? Are they meaning from our report?
No, from the oral update by the High Commissioner, I think. Or maybe it's a bit, could take it either way.
Really,
yeah.
Well, firstly, to deal with our report, because that's what we're holding this Zoom about. Look, speaking personally, I have great expectations from the report because it is so important that there is a considered response. And I think of from the United Nations Human Rights Council, that's obviously a critical place to start. The evidence is substantial, it's well informed, people have been courageous in coming forward, they've in fact risked their lives. So that's a responsible way to deal with that report. If the question was referring to the report from that we're expecting to come forward from the United Nations Human Rights Council later this year, look, I think it's hard to say because at the moment, we've got to be frank, it was not a good result that they did not resolve to actually follow through with an investigation in the Philippines. But again, I believe the Investigateph does put enormous emphasis, or enormous, that's the wrong word, enormous, it builds up a body of evidence that really is very hard to ignore. So, I mean, I've seen the Australian government not be very principled when they were involved on the Human Rights Council. And so it's a big mixture. And yes, this can become quite political in terms of the relationships with the different members there. So we can't call how it will be. If it's fair, it certainly will be a good response. But the pressure from the communities within the Philippines and the international communities working for human rights to be respected in the Philippines, and for all the shocking crimes to end, and for there to be accountability across the board, that will continue. Like, this movement is not going to stop until there's a resolution, whatever that report does bring forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee. We're going to have to stop the Q&A there because of the time. We've come up to the hour, actually. There's a couple more comments there about the way the ICC think and work, and can it happen, and also a question about red tagging. But I had to refer you to the report. A link to the second report of Investigateph is now there in the chat, so especially media workers, anyone, all of you are welcome to download that through that link. I would like to now say some thank yous, but before I do, if any of the media workers here wish to pursue a interview with one of the commissioners, and anyone else from Investigate PH, please contact those coordinators, the communications coordinators whose details are on the media release. So I urge everyone to read this report, promote it, and see how you could assist with its recommendations. I want to especially thank our 4 presenters tonight, Lee, Chris, Suzanne, and Ruby Lynn. I want to thank the media workers who have participated in this tonight, today, your time, all the other people from the Philippines and around the world who have attended. We've had over 100 people attending. So I want to thank our Investigate PH teams who made it all possible, the commissioners, the coordinators, the Philippine partners, the collator's team, the witness coordination team, the writers team, the communications team, and the tech team. Thank you all very, very much. We are now poised to begin the work on our final report, which will be launched in September during the 48th regular session of the UN Human Rights Council, at which High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet will give that oral report we've just had a quick discussion about. So I'll leave you all there. We have so much work to do. And as Ruby Lynn said, somehow, one way or the other, we have to stop these killings. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.